Hello, my name is Ilsa Willems. I'm a CVI project coordinator at the CVI Center at Perkins, and in this video, we'll be discussing form accessibility. Individuals with CVI have varying abilities to access objects or learning materials in different forms. On this slide, you'll see a spray cleaning bottle in all different forms, from realistic to more abstract. So initially on the left, you'll see a 3D spray bottle, then a photograph, a clear photograph of that exact same item, and lots of other different spray bottles, clear images. And then we move to more abstract. So we have a colored abstract version of the spray bottle and a black and white version of the spray bottle. And for our students with CVI, some versions of the spray bottle are going to be more visually accessible to them versus others. And usually it's those realistic versions that are more accessible than the abstract versions. What does the research say about form accessibility? What do we already know about form accessibility? So we know that in order to recognize an object, we need to understand the form, be able to see all those details. We also know that many individuals with CVI have reduced contrast sensitivity and that they really benefit from more high contrast materials. Those are usually more visually accessible for them, easier for them to see. In terms of two-dimensional materials, generally, those clear, realistic photographs as well as printed words are recommended. They're more visually accessible than the abstract versions. So some individuals with CVI can visually attend to and recognize three-dimensional materials, but they can struggle with interpreting two-dimensional materials. Oftentimes, realistic three-dimensional and two-dimensional materials are more visually accessible than abstract or symbolic materials. And form accessibility requires ongoing assessment. So in this slide, you can see a photograph of a cute little dog, and it's a clear photograph, so usually easier for our students to know that that's a dog if they're ready for two-dimensional. And then you can also see a more symbolic colored version of a dog, and that can be harder for our students to look at that image and still know that it's a dog. The impact of form accessibility. Some individuals with CVI do better with realistic three-dimensional materials, but they can move on to two-dimensional once they show readiness for that two-dimensional material. So again, we really want that ongoing evaluation, ongoing assessment, so that we know when our students are ready to transition from one kind of form to another. And sometimes you don't go from just 3D to 2D. There might be something in between. So in this slide, you can see a student who's using embedded tactile symbols to set up his schedule. So he has a symbol for eating, getting dressed, and then brushing his teeth. A nice morning routine. But instead of the actual full fork, the real fork that he might use, it's just the tip of a fork. So those embedded tactile symbols to perhaps potentially move on to two-dimensional materials over time once this student shows readiness for that. Some individuals with CVI, they might continue to prefer more realistic images and items versus this abstract versions. Colored items and images can continue to be easier to attend to versus the black and white materials. And they can continue to more readily interpret familiar three-dimensional and two-dimensional materials versus those novel, newer items. On this slide, you can see one way that a student is able to choose his snack items. So this specific student is ready for an array of 4 choices, and he's ready for clear photographs. These are all very familiar snack items for the student. So clear photographs of those items, and then he's able to make his choice of what he'd like to eat for snack that day. And unlike those photographs that we saw on the last slide, some individuals with CVI do best with 3D whole objects. The 3D objects really give us much more information. They're able to touch it, perhaps smell it. It's not just visually that they can access the item. So once it turns into 2D, then of course we're relying on just their vision. And some students really need a more multimodal way of being able to understand what is being presented to them. So sometimes perhaps the full 3D objects are what's most appropriate. Some individuals with CVI can benefit from a combination. It doesn't have to be just 3D or just 2D. There might be a nice time transitioning in between and using both three-dimensional and two-dimensional materials in order to best understand what is being presented to them. So in this photograph, there's a little girl who's reading Pete the Cat. I love Pete the Cat. So Pete the Cat and his 4 groovy buttons. She has the actual book. Then she has an actual Pete the Cat 3D item, stuffed animal. She has real buttons that she can feel as they're popping off to really expand on that experience. And she also has her eye gaze device to be able to communicate that way as well. Some individuals with CVI can benefit from a combination of realistic photographs and printed words. Just like the last slide was a combination of 3D and 2D, there might be other combinations that work best for your student. So for this student, he's setting up his calendar. He has printed words for the days of the week, and then he's also using photographs to say what the weather is today. So for that day, it was a beautiful, partly cloudy, sunny day. He's adding that photograph to his calendar. For some students, printed words are easier than 2-dimensional materials. So for example, we talked about the image of a dog earlier in this video. And the word dog, D-O-G, is always going to look the same versus images of a dog. There's thousands of different images of a dog, and it could always look different for a student. So that printed word might be more visually accessible than using 2D materials. Here's one example of how a parent adapted a worksheet that came home for their child with CVI. So on the top, you can see the worksheet that was sent home, and they're working on different letters. So see V, W, X, Y, and Z, and all black and white images underneath that. And this mom just asked her child what the child saw. So for example, for the image of the V for van, the child labeled that as a car. For W was supposed to be wind. You can see this cloud, things blowing out of the cloud. So the child just called it a cloud, wasn't quite understanding where that wind was coming into play. X was supposed to be fox, and the child called it a squirrel. And you can see probably focusing on that fluffy tail, perhaps the pointed ears, the snout, wasn't quite seeing the difference between the fox and the squirrel. And then for Y was a crayon with just the word yellow printed inside of it. So the child, of course, just called it a crayon because there was no color cueing to help. So instead, here's an example of how the parent then adapted that to make it more visually accessible. So a van, making a clear photograph of a van, wind using windmills instead of that cloud. For fox, the parent highlighted the visual attributes so the student can more easily see a difference between the fox and the squirrel. And then for the yellow crayon, it was really colored in yellow, the crayon, versus just relying on the word yellow to help them understand what that image was. And here's the current research and literature that we have on form accessibility. Hopefully over time, this will continue to increase, of course, as we continue to do more research in this field. Lastly, every child with CVI is teachable. Every child has a right to a meaningful and accessible education. If you'd like more information on CVI in general, or more information specifically on form accessibility, check out cvinow.org.